We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Asia Times has a piece entitled, Vietnam Sees a Shared Future More with China Than U.S. When Phu Trong's anti-corruption purge means Vietnam is moving in a more ideological and less pro-Western direction. What signals are being sent by this ideological move, especially when China and Australia trade talks have Prime Minister Anthony Albanese anticipating Beijing visit later this year? For insight into this, we turn to our next guest. He's a journalist, author, political analyst, and reporter for RT, Caleb Maupin. As always, Caleb, welcome back.
Glad to be here, as always.
Caleb, I saw combining these two stories as a real indication. It seems as though just about every day we look at what's transpiring on the geopolitical landscape, and it's President Xi going to African countries. It's African leaders going to Russia. It's Xi going to Australia. These guys are traveling the world, even Maduro, traveling the world, developing trade or engaging in trade conversations and developing trade relations. In the United States is the odd man out time and time again. Your thoughts, Caleb Maupin?
Well, I think that first article you shared about how Vietnam is pivoting in a more friendly to China direction is very, very important, because for decades, there has been a huge effort on the part of U.S. leaders to divide Vietnam and China. Following the Vietnam War, when Vietnam was finally reunified, we saw, China and the United States backing Pol Pot in 1978. It was called the Kampuchea War. And this was very much engineered by Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski. And they realized there was a divide, and that there are long-standing ethnic differences in that part of the world, and that Vietnam and China have differences with each other. And China very much needed U.S. investment to get their economy going again. The Soviet Union was not their friend at that point. And so it looks like there was a horrendous event. It was a horrendous war, the Kampuchea War, involving Pol Pot in Cambodia, involving China attacking Vietnam, and it was a disaster. Things got better during the 1980s, but we've seen even in more recent years, that during the Obama administration, Barack Obama went to Vietnam, Vietnam hosted U.S. battleships, and that the divisions between the two countries, and there's disputed territory, there are disputed islands, and the United States has really done a lot to play up the differences between these two strong socialist countries. The Vietnamese Communist Party is in power. The Chinese Communist Party is in power, and they have very strong trade and relations with each other. But it seemed like, especially during the Obama years, there was a real big effort on the part of the United States to play Vietnam against China, to court Vietnam as an ally against China. And the Vietnamese Communist Party was very divided over that. And we heard very anti-China statements made by Vietnamese leaders at one point, and then we would hear them shift and then make very sympathetic pro-China statements. And it seems like all of this has culminated, and now we're getting to the point where Vietnam is making an ultimate decision, which is we have our differences with China. China has done bad things to us in the past, and we don't appreciate everything that China has done. However, our main enemy is the United States, the country that killed millions of us, that prevented us from establishing our independence and unifying our country. And despite our differences with China, we want to continue doing businesses with China. We want to continue doing business with China. We want to find common ground. And this is a big moment. And this is kind of a defeat for, what Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger worked for years to carry out, that resulted in a lot of deaths and division. This is a big step forward. And it appears that what the Obama administration was doing, trying to use Vietnam as a U.S. ally against China, didn't work ultimately. And that Vietnam, they may not agree with the Chinese Communist Party. They may, have disputes about territories and islands and history. But when it gets down to it, they realize that both of them are countries that have historically been poor. that are trying to raise their people up from poverty. They have communist parties in power that are trying to use a centrally planned economy and control of the means of production and the banks and the factories and industries to raise their people up. And they've both been very successful doing so. And in Vietnam, they call their system the socialist-oriented market economy. And they've studied Deng Xiaoping. And they've also studied, the achievements of other economies in the region, such as Singapore. And the World Economic Forum actually speaks very highly of their results. Vietnam has carried out an economic miracle through what they've done, through funding education for the population, through what they've done in terms of building infrastructure, building power plants. And, they have really set the stage to build a very strong and prosperous country. And it's also worth noting that Vietnam's COVID numbers were particularly low. COVID did not devastate Vietnam, and their economy did very, very well. So the fact that Vietnam and China are getting closer, the fact that Vietnam, despite its history of differences with China, is realizing that China is a better friend than the United States could ever be. This is a step forward, I think.
Well, another thing on that particular issue is that Vietnam is next to China. When Donald Trump went to Vietnam, for all of his anti-socialism rhetoric, he left Vietnam and he said, wow, they've done amazing things with their economy and their economy is wonderful. And he didn't stop to think that, well, I thought socialism didn't work and you hated a socialist country. But here's the thing, Caleb. Part of the reason that countries like Vietnam and some of these other Asian, what I will call them satellites of China, are so successful is because they have this gigantic economic machine next to them that is friendly with them. They've got a giant market to sell things that they make to, and they have a gigantic opportunity for resources and things that they need. So the success of China bleeds out into Vietnam and these other countries. So it would be economic suicide and against their national self-interest to go with the U.S. from 7,000 miles away to kill the goose that's been laying their golden egg. Caleb.
Well, I'm going to have to disagree with you just a little bit there. I don't agree that Vietnam is a satellite of China. I don't think the Vietnamese would appreciate, being said about them. They have their historical differences, but they just realize that China is a better friend than the United States would be. And also, I think a big factor in this is while Obama and Trump, they talked really nice and they, took photo ops and took pictures and stuff there. At the same time, the United States has never paid the reparations to the Vietnamese people that were promised. At the treaty that was signed at the end of the Vietnam War, the United States said it was going to pay reparations to the Vietnamese people for killing millions of them during the Vietnam War. It's never been paid. Furthermore, in Vietnam, the United States continues to fund NGOs and organizations that are trying to bring down the Communist Party. And that, Vietnam has done a lot to reform its practices. It does a lot to make sure that Roman Catholics and religious people are able to practice their faith, despite the fact that they have an atheistic Communist Party that's in power. But if you go to the State Department website and if you listen to U.S. officials, you would think that Vietnam is this horrendous place where all Christians are rounded up and killed. That's just a bunch of lies. Anyone who's been to Vietnam knows that. But the USA promotes that. The USA has gatherings where they kind of mobilize, Christians from around the world to believe that the Vietnamese government is their enemy, that it's trying to persecute Christians. And the U.S. government, while it talked nice at Vietnam occasionally when trying to court them as an ally against China, it also was involved in efforts to try and pull off some kind of color revolution there. And it never even ceased that. They never even had the sense to put that on hold when they were trying to court China, as if the Vietnamese didn't know what was going on. They couldn't tell what was happening. They couldn't read the Western newspapers and see the lies that were being spread about their country. So I think that this makes sense. And that ultimately, the other thing that's very interesting is that, it seems like, during the Cold War, in that region, when you talk about other countries that are aligning with China in that region. During the Cold War, the model that the United States wanted is the United States, we propped up these brutal military regimes, these authoritarian military regimes that were seen as like a barrier against communism. And that was the policy. And a lot of these Asian tiger countries, South Korea and the economy of Singapore, and these were like authoritarian military regimes backed by the United States to defeat communists. But then when the Soviet Union fell, all of a sudden the USA transitioned to suddenly wanting the open society. You had George Soros and the Open Society Institute, and you had this model of let's not have a big, strong military authoritarian state. to defeat the communists. Instead, let's have a really weak, pathetic government that just rolls over and auctions the country off to the highest bidder and can't stand up to Wall Street, can't stand up to banks, and just lets American corporations just go in there and do whatever they want. And that was the new model. And in Asia in particular, there were a number of countries that were not communist, keep in mind, but they weren't willing to accept the open society. They said, no, we appreciate that these military governments, Myanmar is a great example of this. We appreciate that these military governments came in here and built up our economy. And no, we're not going to replace it with some weak, pathetic open society government that brings in austerity and auctions our country off the highest bidder and grinds us into poverty. We want a strong state that's going to build up our economy. China says, great, we will be happy to work with you. And we have a military that can work with your military. And we can loan you money to build infrastructure and such. So in a weird way, as the United States and its policies shifted away from the Cold War, China was able to solidify a relationship with governments that had oddly been formed as a barrier against communism. It's kind of the irony of history.
It's interesting to me. About 4 years ago, I think I was reporting that the fastest growing economy in the world was Vietnam. And a lot of people were shocked to hear that. And I'd say now, look at the label, for example, in a lot of the clothing that you wear. A lot of that clothing now is made in Vietnam. But I wanted to get to this point in the article. They write, the decade-old anti-corruption drive led by Communist Party of Vietnam General Secretary Nguyen Phu Trong gained momentum in recent years. And this is very similar to the anti-corruption policies that have been employed by the Communist Party of China. Can you speak to this anti-corruption issue? We've got about 2 minutes.
Sure. Well, when Xi Jinping took office, when he became the new leader of the Chinese Communist Party, he made every member of the party watch 2 films. One was about the crimes of U.S. imperialism around the world and the horrors of U.S. regime change operations. And the second was about the fall of the Soviet Union and how the Soviet Union had been toppled, how there hadn't been a civil war, how the U.S. had been able to engineer the overthrow of the Soviet Union. He made every member of the party watch that. And he said, this is what we need to know, and we need to make sure that such a thing doesn't happen here. And it sounds to me like the Vietnamese, despite their differences, et cetera, are learning from what's going on in China and realizing that, there may be a lot of people in the party, in the Vietnamese Communist Party that are just there because they want to make money or just there because it's the government. So, they're signing up. And they're saying, no, if you want to be part of this party, you got to understand where we came from. You got to understand Ho Chi Minh and his ideology. You got to understand Marxism, Leninism, which is the foundation of our form of government. And we got to make sure that we don't have a situation like what happened in the Soviet Union in 1991. And I think that that's what's going on there, and that they're trying to roll back any kind of liberal or under the surface capitalist thinking within the Vietnamese party.
Caleb Maupin, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Sure thing. Always a pleasure.
Folks, you're listening to The Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon. I'm joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon. There's more on the other side. Stay tuned.